What would you do if you discovered that the children you've raised and loved aren't biologically yours, and the truth leads back to someone you trusted the most? For Florida soldier David Reynolds, this revelation unraveled his entire world, turning loyalty and devotion into rage and betrayal. What happened next left a community in shock and a once heroic figure behind bars. Stay tuned as we delve into the dark secrets, devastating truths, and a deadly quest for justice that shook an entire town. In a quiet neighborhood in Orlando, Florida, nestled among tree-lined streets, the Reynolds family was the pride of their close-knit community. David Reynolds, a decorated Army veteran, was a man of honor and discipline. To his neighbors, he was the embodiment of the American dream, a devoted husband, loving father, and respected member of the town. His wife, Sarah, was his perfect counterpart, a dedicated homemaker who kept the family running smoothly while David served multiple tours overseas. Together, they had built a life that seemed almost too good to be true. David's father, Robert Reynolds, was a retired Army officer who had been a cornerstone of David's upbringing. As a younger man, Robert had served his country with distinction, earning respect both on and off the battlefield. In Orlando, he was known not just as a veteran but as a mentor, a man who guided others with his wisdom and strength. To David, Robert was more than a father. He was a hero, a role model who had taught him everything he knew about discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice. The Reynolds family was admired for their unity and strength. Sunday dinners at Robert's home were a cherished tradition. Friends and neighbors often spoke of the laughter that echoed from the Reynolds' backyard during these gatherings. David would grill while his 4 children played, and Robert would sit at the head of the table, leading prayers and sharing stories from his time in the military. These were the moments David lived for, the moments that reminded him why he had fought so hard during his deployments. Sarah, meanwhile, was the glue that held the family together during David's long absences. She managed the household with quiet determination, juggling carpools, PTA meetings, and countless late nights helping the kids with homework. Her warmth and kindness were well known in the community. To everyone who knew her, Sarah was the picture of grace under pressure, a wife who stood by her husband through thick and thin. But even the strongest families can harbor secrets, and the Reynolds were no exception. Beneath the surface of their idyllic life, there were cracks that no one noticed, or perhaps chose to ignore. Sarah's laughter at family dinners sometimes felt forced. Her glances toward Robert during conversations were fleeting, but held an edge of discomfort. And Robert, the ever-present patriarch, seemed to grow more reserved over the years, as if burdened by an invisible weight. Orlando, Florida was a city where appearances mattered, and the Reynolds' perfect life was something the community celebrated, a beacon of hope and stability. But the truth, as it often is, was far more complicated. One decision, one seemingly innocent act, would soon unravel their world and expose a secret that had been buried for over a decade, a secret that would shatter their family and leave the entire community reeling in shock. It all started with what seemed like a harmless idea. During a Sunday dinner at Robert's house, surrounded by laughter and the smell of home-cooked food, David suggested a family DNA test. He had seen an ad online and thought it would be fun for everyone to explore their ancestry. It was a chance to bond as a family and learn about their roots. "What do you all think?" David asked, smiling as he looked around the table. His 5 children lit up with excitement, imagining stories of royal bloodlines or distant relatives in far-off lands. Even Robert chuckled, raising his glass in agreement, but Sarah's reaction was different. Her smile faltered, and she hesitated before quietly saying, "Do we really need to? I mean, these things aren't always accurate." Her tone was light, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. David brushed off her reluctance with a laugh. "Come on, Sarah, it's just for fun. What's the harm? We've got nothing to hide." His reassurances were met with cheers from the kids, and Sarah, visibly uncomfortable, eventually nodded. Across the table, Robert's expression remained calm, though his jaw tightened for a moment before he joined in the laughter. The kits were ordered that night. When the results arrived a few weeks later, the family gathered around the computer in the living room, buzzing with anticipation. David logged into the DNA testing website and the room filled with excitement as he began scrolling through the results. The kids eagerly pointed out their shared ancestral regions, laughing at the mix of origins they never knew about. Everything seemed perfect, until David noticed something strange. At first, it didn't register. David furrowed his brow as he clicked on his relationship matches. "That's weird," he muttered under his breath. The children crowded around, asking what was wrong. "It's probably just a glitch," he said, trying to mask his growing unease. But as he looked closer, the confusion deepened. According to the results, he wasn't a genetic match to any of his children. He laughed nervously, shaking his head. "This can't be right," he said, glancing at Sarah, who had gone pale. "It's obviously a mistake. These things aren't perfect like you said, Sarah." She nodded quickly, her voice unsteady as she replied, "Yeah, that's probably all it is." But David couldn't let it go. He contacted the DNA testing company, explaining the situation and asking them to recheck the data. The representative on the phone assured him they would review the results and get back to him. Days passed, and the waiting only added to his anxiety. He found himself replaying conversations with Sarah, noticing small moments he had once dismissed, the tension in her voice, her hesitation about the test. When the company responded, the explanation was clear but devastating. The results were correct. The children were not biologically his. Even more shocking, the company indicated that another submitted sample from within the family matched the children's DNA. David's heart sank as the realization began to dawn. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. In the days that followed, David tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe there was some other explanation, some mistake they hadn't accounted for. He pored over the data obsessively, searching for any sign of error. But the truth was inescapable, and with each passing day, the weight of it grew heavier. He began to notice things he had never questioned before: Robert's frequent presence during his deployments, the way Sarah had grown distant at times, the looks they exchanged when they thought no one was watching. The DNA test, which had begun as a light-hearted family activity, now hung over David like a storm cloud. The answers he had sought to bring them closer as a family had instead opened the door to questions he wasn't ready to face. And deep down, he knew that the truth, when it finally came to light, would change everything. The email from the DNA testing company had been sitting in David's inbox for over an hour. He had been pacing the living room, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. When he finally sat down to open it, his heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest. The words stared back at him, cold and clinical. "The results have been reviewed and confirmed. There is no error." David felt the air leave his lungs as he read the final blow. "Another submitted sample within your family matches the children's DNA as their biological parent." For a moment, everything went silent. The world around him seemed to blur as the realization hit. There was only one other submitted sample: his father, Robert. David's hands shook as he printed the results and drove home. His mind raced, but every thought came back to the same conclusion. Sarah, the woman he had trusted with his life, had been lying to him. And Robert, the man he had idolized, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. When David walked through the door, Sarah was in the living room folding laundry. She looked up and smiled, but her expression changed the moment she saw his face. "David, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Without a word, David dropped the printed DNA results onto the table. The papers fanned out, exposing the truth in black and white. "Explain this," he said, his voice low and sharp. Sarah froze, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. What is this?" she stammered, though her eyes told him she already knew. "The DNA results," David snapped, stepping closer. "They say I'm not the father of my own kids, Sarah. But you already knew that, didn't you?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she shook her head. "David, please, let me explain." "Explain?" David's voice rose, shaking with anger. "Explain how all 5 of our children aren't mine? Explain how the biological match is my own father? Go ahead, Sarah. I'd love to hear this one." Sarah collapsed into the chair, her tears flowing freely now. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. David's fists clenched at his sides. What wasn't supposed to happen? He demanded. Say it, Sarah. I want to hear you say it. Through her sobs, Sarah finally broke. It started when you were deployed, she admitted. I was so lonely, David. I missed you so much, and Robert, he was there. He would come over to help with the kids to check on me. At first it was just conversations, but then… Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. David stared at her, his mind reeling. Flashbacks of his father's frequent visits, his constant presence during David's absences, played in his mind like a haunting film. Moments that once seemed innocuous now felt insidious. How long, Sarah? David asked, his voice cold. How long has this been going on? Sarah looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. It was years ago, she said. It ended after the first few months. I swear, David, I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know what to do. You didn't know what to do, David repeated, his voice rising. You could have stopped it by telling him no, by telling me. But instead, you lied to me every single day. You let me raise 5 kids thinking they were mine. Do you have any idea what you've done? Sarah reached for his hand, but he pulled away. David, I love you, she pleaded. It was a mistake, a horrible, terrible mistake. But I love you, and I love our children. Our children? David laughed bitterly. They're not mine, Sarah. They're his. As the weight of the betrayal pressed down on him, David felt something shift inside. His love for Sarah, his respect for Robert, his sense of self, all of it was crumbling. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. For hours, David drove aimlessly, the DNA results crumpled in the passenger seat beside him. His thoughts spiraled, moving from anger to despair and back again. Memories of family dinners, Christmas mornings, and bedtime stories flashed through his mind, now tainted by the knowledge that the life he had built was a lie. He thought about Robert, his father, his hero, who had sat across from him at countless family gatherings, smiling and laughing as if nothing was wrong. The man who had taught him about honor and integrity had been living a lie all along. When David finally returned home, it was late. The house was dark, and Sarah was waiting for him in the living room, her face pale and drawn. David, she began, but he cut her off. I can't even look at you, he said, his voice hollow. I trusted you, Sarah. I trusted both of you. And you both destroyed me. Sarah's sobs filled the silence as David turned and walked upstairs. That night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the betrayal replaying over and over in his mind. The family he had devoted his life to protecting was gone, and the people he loved most had become strangers. The DNA test had started as a simple family activity, but it had exposed a truth that would haunt David forever. The foundation of his life was crumbling, and he knew the storm was far from over. David's life had become unrecognizable. In the days following Sarah's confession, he barely slept. His mind was a storm of anger, betrayal, and despair. Every memory he cherished, his children's first steps, their laughter during family game nights, the pride he felt as a father, was now tainted. The thought that Robert, the man he had idolized, had fathered his children filled him with a rage he could barely contain. David began to withdraw from everyone. He spent hours sitting in his truck, parked aimlessly around Laurel, replaying the events in his mind. Flashbacks of his father's frequent visits to the house while he was deployed consumed him. The way Robert had always been eager to help, how Sarah had often seemed tense when he returned from duty. It all made sense now, and it only deepened the wound. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was physical. He felt it in his chest, a searing pain that wouldn't relent. David stopped eating and ignored calls from friends and colleagues. When he wasn't alone in his truck, he was in the garage, pacing with the DNA results in hand. Over and over, he read the words that confirmed his worst fears. The paper crumpled and smudged from his grip. Then came the nightmares. In his sleep, he saw Robert's face, calm, smug, and unrepentant. In his dreams, he heard Sarah's voice pleading for forgiveness, but the sound only fueled his anger. Each morning, he woke up feeling more detached from the life he once cherished. Despite his turmoil, David couldn't avoid seeing Robert. The upcoming Sunday dinner loomed like a dark cloud. It was a tradition they had upheld for years, and while he debated skipping it, something inside him demanded that he go. He needed answers. He needed Robert to face what he had done. The tension at the dinner was palpable from the moment David arrived. Sarah's forced smile and the children's innocent chatter only made the atmosphere heavier. David barely touched his food, his eyes fixed on Robert, who sat at the head of the table, eating as if nothing was wrong. When dinner was over, David finally spoke. His voice cut through the air like a knife. "Robert," he said, his tone measured but icy, "we need to talk." Robert looked up, his expression calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Sure, son. What's on your mind?" David clenched his fists under the table. "Don't call me that," he snapped, his voice rising. "You lost the right to call me son the moment you destroyed my family." The room fell silent. Sarah's face turned pale, and the children froze, their eyes darting between their father and grandfather. "Kids, go to your rooms," David said, his voice firm but trembling. "Now." As the children hurried upstairs, Sarah stood, her voice shaking. "David, please, sit down," he barked, glaring at her. "You've said enough." Robert set his utensils down, his calm facade crumbling. "David, I don't know what you think you know, but don't you dare lie to me," David roared, slamming his fist on the table. "I know everything. The DNA results, Sarah's confession. You're their father, my children, my life. You took everything from me." Robert raised his hands defensively, his voice steady but firm. "David, listen to me. I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake. It was never supposed to go this far." David's laugh was bitter and hollow. "A mistake? A mistake is spilling coffee, not fathering 5 children with your own son's wife. How could you do this to me? How could you sit there year after year pretending to be a loving father and grandfather while you were stabbing me in the back?" Robert's tone grew sharper. "You don't understand, David. You were gone, and Sarah—" "Don't you dare put this on me," David interrupted, his voice shaking with rage. "You were supposed to protect my family, not destroy it." The argument escalated, voices rising, each word cutting deeper than the last. Sarah tried to intervene, tears streaming down her face. "Please stop. You're tearing this family apart." David turned to her, his face a mask of pain and fury. "It's already destroyed, Sarah. You and him made sure of that." In a fit of rage, David lunged at Robert, knocking over a chair as he closed the distance between them. He grabbed his father by the collar, his face inches away. "You ruined my life," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. Robert shoved him back, trying to defuse the situation, but David's anger had reached a boiling point. He grabbed a knife from the table, his hand trembling with fury. "You deserve to pay for what you've done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "David, no!" Sarah screamed, rushing forward to stop him, but it was too late. In the chaos, David lashed out, plunging the knife into Robert's chest. The older man staggered, blood seeping through his shirt as he collapsed to the floor. Sarah fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, while David stood frozen, the knife still in his hand. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, a neighbor having called the police after hearing the commotion. When the officers arrived, they found David sitting on the porch, the knife lying on the ground beside him. His face was blank, his hands stained with blood. He didn't resist as they cuffed him, his voice barely audible as he muttered, "They took everything from me." Inside, the officers discovered the grim scene. Robert's lifeless body on the floor, Sarah kneeling beside him, her sobs filling the room. The once pristine dining room, a symbol of family unity, was now a scene of unimaginable violence. David's rage had boiled over, leaving destruction in its wake. The man who had dedicated his life to protecting others was now at the center of a tragedy that would haunt him and his family forever. The trial of David Reynolds gripped the small town of Laurel, Mississippi, and soon became a national headline. A respected soldier turned accused murderer, David's story left the community divided. Some saw him as a man driven to the edge by unimaginable betrayal, while others condemned his actions as unforgivable. In court, the prosecution painted a stark picture of premeditated violence. They argued that David had every opportunity to walk away, but chose instead to take justice into his own hands. The DNA test, they claimed, was not an excuse for murder, but rather the trigger for a calculated act of vengeance. The defense, however, told a different story. They described a man broken by the people he trusted most, his wife and his father. Expert witnesses testified about David's PTSD from years of military service and the psychological toll of the betrayal he endured. They portrayed him as a victim of circumstance, a man pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. After days of testimony and emotional arguments, the jury returned with a verdict. David was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The court acknowledged the profound emotional turmoil that led to his actions, but the sentence served as a reminder that even the deepest pain cannot justify taking a life. The community's reaction was a mix of shock, sympathy, and sorrow. Neighbors who once admired the Reynolds family struggled to reconcile the image of the perfect household with the dark truths that had been revealed. For Laurel, the tragedy became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the closest families can harbor devastating secrets. The story of David Reynolds leaves us grappling with questions that have no easy answers. How far can betrayal push someone before they break? Was David a victim of circumstance or a man who let his rage destroy him? This tragic tale reminds us of the devastating power of secrets and the fragility of trust. Could things have turned out differently if the truth had surfaced earlier? Or was the tragedy inevitable? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories that delve into the darkest corners of human nature.